What is black psychology? Black psychology is looking at the perceptions, values, worldview from the perspective of black folks as they articulate it. So that we didn't discover black psychology in the 60s, it was already there, but we articulated it from the perspective of the folks themselves. We wanted to give them their own voice. Whereas prior to that time, that voice was invisible in psychology, or it was deficit deficiency, low IQ, poor impulse control, can't delay gratification, can't do a complex task. So the story had been told from outside, and we wanted to tell it from inside out.
Black psychology is part of what we would call the Black Studies movement. The Black Studies movement is a movement to capture the experience of a particular people, in this case, people of African descent. It's, in terms of psychology, it's an attempt to be that strand of Black studies that focuses on the psychology of a people, in this case, people of African descent. It is a movement that's part reactionary, part proactive. Reactionary in the sense that mainstream psychology and mainstream cultural studies either did not pay much attention to the black experience, or even worse, tended to scaffold it in pejorative terminology and results. So it's both a correction, but it's also an affirmation. It's no accident that it eventually evolved into something called African psychology, because some of the people who are concerned with the study of black people are also concerned with going back in time and space and seeing the connection to our ultimate roots.
Now, black psychology, I think of as having begun in reaction to what we had learned about identifying who we were. And when I say what we had learned as captives within a Euro-American, a European frame of reference, a European definition of what was reality, what was real, and what it meant to be human. And so our introduction to psychology then was reacting to that. So we had to kind of deconstruct that. And that deconstruction says, okay, we must no longer see ourselves as we were defined by this other perspective, which is not our own perspective. And therefore, we need to identify it as a perspective that, in fact, identifies who we are. So it became a kind of a liberation tool. How do we kind of free the captives from this alien perspective of defining themselves?
May I say something to you to give you a true knowledge of yourself and life, so that the same glory and success attained by other men who understand themselves may be yours? So there is no excuse for the black man in lacking the knowledge that man is used to beautify the world and produce all that he needs for his happiness and civilization. If you are able to live with the knowledge of yourself and with the greater knowledge of nature, you must know what is good and what is not.
It's a spectrum. On one side of the spectrum is Africa. And then a writer has to decide how deep he wants to go into the foundation of Africa to understand these brothers in Oakland today. And some go all the way back to ancient Egypt, and some pick it up more when we come here to the States. But it's all part of one model, I'd say, that has different variations.
My black psychology also has a cultural component, because it's only from the cultural grounding of what I call the wisdom tradition of African deep thought that conception of black makes sense. So African psychology would be inclusive of black psychology based on my definition, but African psychology, I think in most people's mind's eye, again speaks to a particular cultural orientation, of which my definition could be a part.
Black psychology within that vein generally refers to psychology related to the African American experience in some camps of the black psychology community. And African American psychology, of course, would be used interchangeably with that usage of black psychology. Of course, African psychology, the way I use it, has a global scope. in terms of ethnicity and racial application.
The further you go back into the African experience or the African ethos, the more you are trying to find a source of original strengths and values that did not emanate from the American experience. So while the American experience is long, it's rich, it has its strengths, but the original values and foundations of people of African descent who live in America came from Africa.
In my work, I actually combine the terms Black and African, or I link them. So I use African/Black psychology to indicate that I'm not only referring to the psychological experience of African Americans or the psychological experience of North Americans, but the psychological experience of diasporian Africans as well as continental Africans, understanding that there may be some contextual variation and even some philosophical variation because of the context, but at the core that the worldview principles would be relatively the same.
As we move from kind of deconstructing that paradigm or deconstructing those assumptions to begin to reconstruct how it was we defined ourselves before our captivity, I think the way that we identified that reconstruction process was to call it African psychology. So I don't like to think of it as being antithetical. I simply see it as being the evolution. It's the older brother, the older sister. It's a more matured perspective of what began as a kind of a reactive form that came to be a kind of a reconstructing of defining ourselves for ourselves from our own ontological perspective.
To me, African psychology was about essentially a cultural war. Cultural war is an ideological struggle where we are literally at war for the minds and hearts and the future of our people. And so the development of the discipline of African psychology really became a cultural war of ideology. It became a cultural war of self-determination, where we as African psychologists determined to chart our own future rather than just following the footsteps of our colleagues in European American psychology. It was a cultural war of values, and that were the values that are central to African psychology going to read the footsteps that we followed, as opposed to embracing someone else's cultural ideology in European and Western psychology. And it was also a war of cultural relevance. African psychology was fundamentally about cultural relevance and whether or not we could develop a psychology that was relevant to the people. And that, to me, is what was important.